Wolfgang Van Halen was 10 years old when he found his father on the bedroom floor at midnight, surrounded by bottles, crying. Wolfgang had seen his dad drink before. He'd seen the fights with his mom. He'd heard the whispers about his parents' marriage falling apart. But he'd never seen this. His father, Eddie Van Halen, the strongest man he knew, completely broken. "Dad," Wolfgang said quietly from the doorway. Eddie looked up at his son, and in that moment, drunk and devastated and dying from cancer, Eddie saw his future. He saw two paths, one where Wolfgang grew up with a father who chose alcohol over him, and one where Eddie fought to be the dad Wolfgang deserved. What Eddie did next saved both their lives. September 8th, 2001. The date was seared into Eddie's memory not because of what would happen 3 days later when the world changed forever, but because of what happened that night in his own home. The night his marriage officially died. The night he had to choose between destruction and redemption. Eddie had suspected for months. Valerie coming home late, new perfume, changed passwords on her phone, the way she looked through him instead of at him. After 16 years of marriage, Eddie knew. But knowing and confirming are different kinds of pain. That evening, Valerie's phone had buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. Eddie normally wouldn't have looked. Despite everything, despite the drinking and the fights and the slow dissolution of their marriage, he'd never invaded her privacy. But something made him pick up that phone. Maybe intuition, maybe desperation, maybe just the universe deciding it was time for the truth. The text message was from a man Eddie didn't know. The content left no room for doubt. Valerie was having an affair, and from the message thread, it had been going on for at least 6 months. Eddie stood in his kitchen, phone in hand, reading words that confirmed his worst fears. His wife, the mother of his son, was in love with someone else, had been for months, while Eddie fought cancer, while Eddie struggled to stay sober, while Eddie tried to be a husband and father despite his body betraying him. He set the phone down carefully, walked to his bedroom, closed the door, and did what he'd been trying not to do for 3 years. He drank. The first bottle was vodka, straight from the bottle, no glass, no ice, no pretense. Eddie drank like a man trying to drown something inside him. And for the first hour, it worked. The alcohol dulled the pain, blurred the betrayal, made the cancer feel less aggressive and the loneliness less suffocating. By 10 p.m., Eddie was on his second bottle. By 11 p.m., he was on the floor. Not because he'd fallen, but because sitting upright required effort he didn't have anymore. The floor felt honest, solid, real. Valerie came home at 11:30 p.m. Eddie heard the front door, heard her footsteps, heard her pause outside the bedroom door, probably smelling the alcohol, probably debating whether to come in. She didn't. She went to the guest room. And somehow that hurt more than the affair. She didn't even care enough to fight about it, didn't care enough to check if he was alive, didn't care at all. Eddie looked at the half-empty bottle in his hand, then at the full one beside it. He could drink until he passed out, drink until he forgot, drink until none of this mattered anymore. The cancer doctor had told him alcohol would accelerate the disease, had told him that his damaged body couldn't process alcohol the way it used to, had told him that drinking now could be fatal. But right now, fatal sounded better than feeling. Eddie raised the bottle to his lips. That's when he heard the small footsteps in the hallway. Wolfgang's footsteps. Eddie knew them by heart, the slight drag of the left foot, the rhythm of a 10-year-old who hadn't quite grown into his legs yet. "Dad?" Wolfgang's voice was small, scared. "Are you okay?" Eddie looked up from the floor. His son stood in the doorway in his pajamas, hair messy from sleep, eyes wide with concern and confusion. In that moment, through the fog of alcohol and pain, Eddie saw himself through Wolfgang's eyes, a drunk on the floor, surrounded by bottles, crying, broken, not a father, not a hero, just a man who'd chosen alcohol over everything else. "Wolfie," Eddie said, his voice slurred and thick. "Go back to bed, buddy. Dad's having a hard night." Wolfgang didn't move. He stood there, 10 years old, looking at his father like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he did something that broke Eddie's heart. Wolfgang walked into the room, sat down on the floor beside his father, and put his small hand on Eddie's arm. "Is it because of Mom?" Wolfgang asked quietly. Eddie's breath caught. "What do you mean? I heard you guys fighting. I hear you fighting a lot, and Mom's not home a lot anymore. And when she is home, she doesn't look at you the same way anymore." Wolfgang's voice was matter of fact, a 10-year-old stating observations without understanding all their implications. "Are you getting divorced?" Eddie wanted to lie, wanted to protect his son from this, but he was too drunk and too honest and too broken to pretend anymore. "Probably, Wolfie." "Yeah, probably." Wolfgang nodded slowly. "Is that why you're drinking?" "Partly." Eddie looked at the bottle in his hand. "The cancer's back too, and drinking makes it hurt less, makes everything hurt less." "But the doctor said drinking is bad for you when you have cancer," Wolfgang said. "You told me that. You said you had to stop." "I did stop," Eddie said. "For 3 years I stopped. But tonight I needed it." Wolfgang was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Do you need it more than you need me?" Eddie stared at his son. That simple question. That devastating question. "Do you need it more than you need me?" In that moment, Eddie Van Halen saw his future split into 2 paths, 2 clear, distinct paths. Path 1. He drinks tonight, he drinks tomorrow, he drinks through the divorce, he drinks through the cancer treatments, he drinks until the alcohol or the cancer wins. Wolfgang grows up with a father who's physically present but emotionally gone, a father who chose the bottle over his son, a father who became a cautionary tale instead of a hero. Path 2. He stops. Right now, right here on this bedroom floor. He pours out the bottles, he fights through the divorce sober, he fights through the cancer sober. He shows Wolfgang that even when life destroys you, even when your body betrays you and your wife betrays you and everything falls apart, you don't give up. You don't choose escape. You choose to stay. You choose to fight. You choose your son. Eddie looked at the bottle in his hand, then at Wolfgang. The choice wasn't complicated. It was the simplest choice he'd ever had to make. "No," Eddie said, his voice breaking. "I don't need it more than I need you. I don't need anything more than I need you." Eddie slowly stood up, using the bed for support. Wolfgang stood up with him. Eddie picked up the half-empty bottle, walked to the bathroom. Wolfgang followed. Eddie unscrewed the cap and poured the vodka down the sink. Then he went back and got the other bottles. All of them. Every bottle in his room. Every bottle in the house that he knew about. Wolfgang watched as his father poured thousands of dollars of alcohol down the drain. Bottle after bottle. Some barely opened, some vintage, some gifts, some trophies from tours. Eddie poured them all out while his 10-year-old son stood witness. When the last bottle was empty, Eddie sat on the bathroom floor again. But this time, Wolfgang sat next to him. And this time, Eddie was sober enough to really see his son, to really understand what was at stake. "Wolfie," Eddie said, "I'm going to tell you something important, and I need you to remember it. Can you do that?" Wolfgang nodded. "Your mom and I are probably going to get divorced. That's not your fault. That's not because of you. That's because adults sometimes can't stay together, and that's okay. You'll still have both of us. We both love you more than anything." Wolfgang's eyes were wet, but he nodded again. "But here's the other thing," Eddie continued. "I'm an alcoholic. Do you know what that means?" "It means you drink too much," Wolfgang said. "It means more than that," Eddie explained. "It means I want to drink even when I know I shouldn't. It means alcohol makes me feel better even though it's making me worse. It means I have to fight every single day not to drink. And some days I lose that fight." "Like tonight," Wolfgang said. "Like tonight," Eddie agreed. "But Wolfie, I'm making you a promise right now. I'm going to win that fight from now on. I'm going to stay sober. I'm going to be the dad you deserve. Because you asked me if I need alcohol more than I need you, and the answer is no. The answer will always be no." Wolfgang leaned against his father. "Mom's really not coming back, is she?" Eddie wrapped his arm around his son. "No, buddy, I don't think so." "Are you going to be okay?" Wolfgang asked. And that question, that role reversal, a 10-year-old asking his father if he was going to be okay. That was the moment Eddie truly understood what alcoholism had done. It had turned his child into the caretaker. It had reversed the natural order. "Yeah, Wolfie," Eddie said, "I'm going to be okay, because I have you, and as long as I have you, I have a reason to be okay." They sat on that bathroom floor for another hour, sometimes talking, sometimes quiet. Sometimes Wolfgang would doze against Eddie's shoulder and Eddie would just hold him, breathing in the scent of his son's shampoo, feeling the steady rhythm of Wolfgang's breathing, understanding with absolute clarity what mattered and what didn't. Valerie didn't matter anymore. The affair didn't matter. The betrayal didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the 10-year-old boy sleeping against Eddie's shoulder, who had asked one simple question and saved his father's life. The divorce proceedings started 3 months later. They were ugly, bitter, complicated by money and fame and hurt feelings. Valerie got primary custody of Wolfgang. Eddie got him on weekends and holidays. The lawyers argued about assets and property and who got what pieces of a broken marriage. Through all of it, Eddie stayed sober. Not perfectly. He had relapses. He had moments where the temptation was overwhelming, but he never drank in front of Wolfgang. And whenever he felt close to breaking, he remembered that question. Do you need it more than you need me? The answer was always no. Eddie started going to AA meetings. At first he went because his lawyer said it would help in the custody battle, but eventually he went because he needed it. He needed to hear other people's stories, needed to understand that addiction wasn't a moral failing, it was a disease. And like cancer, it required constant treatment. Wolfgang noticed the change in his father, noticed that Eddie's hands didn't shake anymore, noticed that his breath didn't smell like mouthwash covering vodka, noticed that when they spent weekends together, Eddie was fully present, really there. Not physically there, but mentally checked out. Actually there. One Saturday afternoon, about a year after the divorce was finalized, Eddie and Wolfgang were in the music studio. Wolfgang was learning bass. Eddie was teaching him. They'd been practicing for hours. Wolfgang set down his bass and looked at his father. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always, Wolfie." "That night, the night you were drinking and I found you, you said you saw 2 paths. What were they?" Eddie was quiet for a moment. He'd never told Wolfgang about that vision. Never explained what happened in those seconds when he looked up and saw his son in the doorway. "One path was me choosing alcohol," Eddie said, "choosing to drink through the pain, through the divorce, through the cancer, through everything. And on that path, I lose you. Maybe not physically. Maybe you'd still come visit on weekends. But I'd lose the real you. I'd lose your respect, your trust, your love." "What was the other path?" Wolfgang asked. "The other path was me choosing you," Eddie said simply. "Choosing to fight, choosing to stay sober, choosing to be the dad you deserved even when everything else was falling apart. And on that path, we get this. We get Saturday afternoons playing music together. We get real conversations. We get to actually know each other." Wolfgang thought about this. "I'm glad you chose the second path." "Me too, buddy. Every single day, I'm glad I chose the second path." Years later, after Eddie's death, Wolfgang would talk about that night in interviews, about finding his father on the floor, about asking one simple question, about how his dad chose him over alcohol. "People ask me when I became close to my dad," Wolfgang would say, like there was a specific moment, and there was. September 8th, 2001. That's when I stopped being just Eddie Van Halen's son and became his reason, his purpose, his why. Wolfgang would pause, emotion thick in his voice. "My dad wasn't perfect. He struggled with addiction his whole life. But from that night forward, he never let it win. Not because he was strong, but because I asked him one question. Do you need it more than you need me? And he looked at me and said no. And then he proved it. Every day for 19 years, he proved it." September 8th, 2001. Eddie Van Halen was drunk on the bedroom floor. His marriage was over. His body was failing. His addiction was screaming for more. And his 10-year-old son asked him one question. That question saved 2 lives. Because Eddie chose Wolfgang. And in choosing Wolfgang, he chose himself. He chose survival. He chose presence. He chose to fight. The bottles stayed empty. The divorce went through. The cancer continued its assault. But Eddie stayed sober. Not for Valerie, not for fame, not for his legacy. For Wolfgang. For the 10-year-old boy who sat on a bathroom floor at midnight and asked his father if he was going to be okay. And because Wolfgang asked, Eddie made sure the answer was yes. Not perfectly, not easily, but yes. He was going to be okay. They both were. Because sometimes the only thing standing between destruction and redemption is one simple question from someone who loves you enough to ask it. Wolfgang Van Halen found his father at his lowest point. And by being there, by asking one devastating question, he gave his father the one thing that alcohol never could: a reason to stay.